Dun, 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 dun. Manage broadcast. Stop streaming. Stop recording. We should be live. Okay. Hello. Wendy's going to do a wee check for us just to make sure if you want to pop in and see if we can find a live stream. But hopefully we're live, Cara. And if anybody's out there watching us, thanks very much for joining us. We're just coming on tonight to sort of help promote Dr. Cara Kennedy's new book, which is entitled Women's Agency in the Dune Universe. And there we go. This is the first time for us, folks, so if you're popping into the station tonight, I'm not too sure if any of you are there, but I know a fair few of you check the live streams afterwards, and we're good. Yeah, everything's looking great. We're all good, Cara. So that's great to know. And there's Babs Bilo. And hello, Babs, how are you? Thanks very much for joining us, saying hello, Doc and Cara. So we're good, Cara. Everything's going according to plan. We're a little bit early tonight. So I'll just run through a few wee things for you. Tonight we're just going to introduce Cara and we'll have a wee bit of a chat about Dune itself and the Dune series. And then we're going to have a wee run through some pre-prepared questions for Cara about her book. And then we're going to open this all up to a Q&A for a bit of fun. So I think this is going to be quite enjoyable. I'm really looking forward to it. And if you do have any questions, type away in the chat room. I'm just going to set that to live chat, so that we can see everybody talking. There we go. Babs saying, looks like it's just little old me right now. Thanks very much for joining us, Babs. By the way, Cara, Babs is a big Dune fan and often asks me quite difficult questions about Alia, for example. So I think she's going to be particularly interested in this. And we do have a bunch of regulars that hopefully they'll join us in and as we go. So we'll just do a wee bit of.
Are we able to put a link to my website on the YouTube description?
Yes, we will. Anything like that. What I'll be doing is once the live stream's done, we can go in and set that up for people to see it again. So we'll be able to put a wee link to purchasing the book, and there's a coupon code, isn't that right? And
or can I put it in the chat?
Yeah.
Oh, you can type it into the chat. Yeah, if you're in the same room. Yeah. Absolutely. This is like a TV studio software thing, so I haven't figured out how to get my chat over here, but yeah, it's all new. But as I said, doing this with yourself, it's kind of kicked me up the backside a bit to go and muck around, and unfortunately I am a computer guy, so I can go too much at it. So I thought what we'd do tonight is just set up something nice and simple, and we have it's quite funny watching it on the other monitor because there's a slight time delay to do with latency and so on. So it's interesting. I think it's very interesting. And as I said, this is the first time we've done this, so I'd like to say thank you very much for joining us, Cara, and thank you very much for being my first ever guest on the studio, on the science fiction station. And
thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great. I'm really delighted. I have to say, we've just been having a wee chat before we came on here, just about, I suppose, our raison d'etre for doing PhDs in Dune, and I think we have a lot in common. And we've been. I'm going to close the window here, folks. Hang on, we've got doggies on the prowl. Oh, sorry, Cara. We've lost Cara a wee bit there. But as you know, folks, generally that we're broadcasting. Our space station is also known as the Doghouse. Because of this is our doghouse, and so hopefully we'll not have too many interruptions from Evil Noodles and Holly Holiday. But they did make an appearance on our last program when we introduced them. So we've been having a good wee chat about just well, I suppose we've met a wee bit and had a lot in common with this doing a PhD in Dune. And I'm just going to read a wee quick comment here from Babs. I'm going to have to bring this a bit closer, aren't we? Figuring out how to do these things. It says, most definitely looking forward to this. Doc knows how much I like academia, bringing your work to we non-university folks. And well, Babs, thank you very much for that comment. And I suppose this is the thing that actually myself, and I hope Cara doesn't mind me saying this, I think the thing that we both have in common is a real strong desire to bring science fiction academia to the general public. And as much as I've done myself, my wee station, Cara's got dunescholar.com, and pretty much has just produced this book. As I said, we're going to have a wee chat about it tonight, but both of us are very much on the same page, and it's all about making this stuff accessible to people, I think. Especially, we were just having a wee chat about how inaccessible some of this stuff is. You know, so
To me, it's science fiction as a genre is one of the most popular genres. So to have it be locked away in the academy is so ironic.
it is. It strikes me as bizarre, and I often thought about it that it's its popularity maybe that is what kind of kept it in that position. I think. We were having a wee chat last night about. It was actually to do with the New Scientist magazine that looked at Dune and all. It was a New Scientist magazine, I think, going back a good few years, and it was asking the question: is science fiction in decline? It was also the issue that polled a lot of scientists as to what is your favourite science fiction book, and of course we all know which book they answered. It was very much a strong win for Dune. And we're actually getting it's a very interesting episode. I was talking about it a wee bit the other day, or should I probably call it an issue of New Scientist, but particularly because it was focused all on science fiction, and had a good wee chat about Dune itself, and particularly its popularity and why it's popular amongst scientists. So I thought it was really interesting, you know. But there is a sense that science fiction academia is outside the rest of the academic world, I think, you know, and I'm sure, I think you agree.
Still on the fringe, I think.
Still on the fringe. And just
moving its way, trying to gain some territory, but... Oh, there's a new book that just came out called Shakespeare in Science Fiction.
Ah.
That looks really interesting.
I've seen a few. What is it? They do. Star Wars has been done as Shakespeare now. There's this kind of.
Oh, those are so fun!
Oh, I haven't read any of them, but I have a big problem with Shakespeare, and I'm sure you all know what it is. Shakespeare rips off the classical world, I think, you know. And I always tell
borrows from Russ. Borrows from.
I don't know. No, actually, massively rips off in a couple of cases. I have to say, he's just literally stolen. But I suppose it was the Renaissance, and that was the point of the Renaissance. All this stuff had come back, you know. But yeah, I'll tell you what, Cara. Shall we get things rolling then?
Sure.
I think because we've hit 9 o'clock. Oh, and I'll tell you what, we've a wee bunch of comments. You know, I'll just read them out before we'll get our introductions going. We've got Carol Blessing saying, "Hello, Cara. So excited about your book." And Bab's saying, "Howdy, Carol. Glad you could join us." We have a Leah McReynolds saying, "Hi, Cara. So excited for this and for you." And hi, Leah. Thanks for coming back. And okay, oh, somebody saying something died, but I think we're all good. We're still online. So I'll let us a few introductory comments, which is nice to hear from people. So we've got a bit of an audience, and as I said, we'll put this up. And oh, here she comes. It's Holly Holiday. Hello, big love. Come on, you. Give me 1 wee second, folks. This is a thing that happens at the doghouse. You ready? Go on. Go get him. Go get him. I'll tell you, give me 1 wee second, folks, just to get this doggy out of here. Come on. Wendy. Sorry, I'm getting invaded. Come on. Out you go. Come on, please. Come on. No, come on now. Right. Seriously, go on. That's a good girl. Good girl. Oh, dear, oh dear. Right, I'm so sorry about that, folks. It's one of the joys of broadcasting from home. As I said, for anybody who doesn't get the reference, our science fiction station is called the Doghouse because it's the name of the space station in Strontium Dog from 2000 AD, where all the mutants hang around. So it's called the Doghouse, and it literally is a doghouse. So I do apologise about that. And I'm just going to start off tonight. We've joined with by Cara Kennedy tonight, Dr. Cara Kennedy. And we're going to have a wee chat about her new book, Women's Agency, in the Dune series. So just to start off, I'm just going to give you a wee bit of an introduction to Cara, and we'll talk a little bit about Dune, just for those who are not too familiar with the series, and then we're going to get some questions to Cara, and I'm going to shut up and let her do all the talking, because you know what I'm like, I'll just keep going. So we'll get Cara on to a wee second. Let's have a wee I'll just run through some of this. As just how I know Cara, by the way, is in terms of, I suppose, reaching out to anybody who's interested in Dune with my academic work. And we've talked a wee bit about this, but of all the people that we have reached out to, Cara's actually the only person who replied to me. And we've had a wee bit of a dialogue going back and forward over the last year or so. And it's been great to sort of actually meet and chat to someone who's as invested in these books as I am. And the other sort of thing I'll just mention before I tell you a wee bit about Cara is that often within my own work, We've talked about this, about how, I suppose, the process of a PhD, where at the end of the day, stuff has to go. And my work got obliterated in terms of things like the Vanity Desert and the feminist aspects of the work, and work on sex and gender. So the one thing that I had said to Cara was that because of that, my work comes across as very, what I would call male-centric, which I was quite appalled by. And I did my PhD on the Dune series about 11 years ago. So what I was absolutely delighted to see was this representation of women in the Dune universe, and that work was being done on these aspects of feminism, sex and gender, etc. And mainly because I was quite appalled that I had to leave them all out. And so I've actually said that I think that our two PhDs actually together really provide a good balance to the Dune universe in terms of academia. And I'm absolutely delighted, by the way, Cara, and just say thank you very much for asking me to do this. It's a real pleasure. So I'm just going to tell you a wee bit about... Oh, thank you. It's genuine, you know. I'm just going to tell you a wee bit about Cara, and we'll just run through a wee bit of information about her and have a wee quick chat about Dune. And as I said, then I'll stop all the gab and we'll get some questions to Cara and let her do the chatting. So just in terms of what Cara's been up to, Cara's been studying Dune for quite some time, as have I. And Cara did her honours project during her undergraduate degree in California and looked at the representation of the character Jessica as a strong woman who went beyond stereotypes despite being in a male-dominated culture. Cara's carried on that work then, went to the UK to do her master's degree and expanded this analysis to include the Bene Gesserit as an organisation as well as other female characters. Ultimately, as you know, the career path leads to a terminus degree. She's ended up in New Zealand and has completed her PhD on the Bene Gesserit across the full 6 books of the Dune series. For those of you who are aware, a lot of academia does not cover the 6 books. It's probably just due to the sheer scale. So she's also got interest in looking at world building, mythopoeia, and has published articles on the role of names, the social sciences, and the influence of Lawrence of Arabia, as well as the spice and ecology in Dune. She believes, as we were talking about, in making science fiction scholarship more accessible to the general public, which is why she started her blog, dunescholar.com, and writes for popular media such as science fiction and fantasy site Tor.com. So that's a wee bit of blurb about Cara. And this is the fun bit, I suppose. I was asked to do a brief summary of Dune. Whoa, is there such a thing? I don't know. I'll go with a wee bit of info here for you. This is for anybody's benefit who doesn't know the Dune series. And of course we have the arrival of Dune Part 1 in the cinema at the minute, directed by Denis Villeneuve, which seems to be doing financially quite well. So Dune was first serialised in multiple instalments in the science fiction magazine Analog from 1963 to 1965 as Dune World and the Prophet of Dune. I've got my copies over there. And is later published as a novel in 1965. So Dune won both the top awards in the science fiction at the time, which is the Hugo and Nebula Awards. And of course there are 5 sequels, the Dune series spanning, I'd argue, probably 3 or 4 decades. The first being 65, the last being published in 85. But if we think that Herbert started really working on this in the 50s. The first film adaptation came out in 1984 by director David Lynch. It's somewhat controversial, I think. No, not necessarily controversial, but I think you either love it or you hate it, and I happen to love it. I think we'll maybe have a chat about our opinions on the new Dune movie later on. And of course we've seen a TV adaptation with the mini-series and followed on by Children of Dune. And then, as I said, we've got the new Denis Villeneuve version. So it's hard to summarise what Dune's all about. It is a bizarre... I suppose it's a very, very dense book, and it's just full of... I don't know how to put it. It's complex. I think that's the word we all like to use. And it is of considerable length. I think it comes in just over 1 million words, and even has a plot that goes across several thousand years. But here's what I'll say. We'll go with a brief description. The Dune series is set in a universe with a medieval-like feudal structure that is developed in response to the Butlerian Jihad, which is a human revolt in the distant past against thinking machines that saw them banned, and forces the creation of human schools of education, if you like, that I suppose, kick away the technical crutch and make humans develop their own abilities. The first Dune book features the story of the family of House Atreides. Duke Leto, Lady Jessica, who's a member of the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood, a semi-religious order of women who are involved in politics of the Imperium, and of course their son Paul, as they move to the planet Dune, the only location of a giant sandworm that happens to produce the most prized thing in the universe, which is the spice, a drug known as melange. And this is of course where their enemies, the Harkonnen and the Emperor, have laid a trap for them. So it's all quite Machiavellian. Obviously things don't go well for the family, and we see a kind of traditional heroic route. Jessica and Paul are forced to escape into the desert, where Jessica uses her Bene Gesserit skills to find safe passage among the locals known as the Fremen, whose tribal culture has been prepared by previous Bene Gesserit women of the mission area Protectiva to accept a Bene Gesserit woman and her child as fulfillments of a prophecy. Whilst pregnant with her second child, Alia, Jessica undergoes the Water of Life ceremony, becomes a religious leader. Excuse me, sorry. Oh, no. Oh dear. I forgot I had a phone in the room. I do apologise, Cara. Sorry about that, folks. That things happen. Where were we? Culture's been prepared. Yeah, sorry, apologies about that. Jessica undergoes the Water of Life ceremony and becomes a religious leader known as a Reverend Mother, which changes both her and Alia's psyches. Because he's part of the Bene Gesserit secret breeding program and his mother trained him in the Bene Gesserit way, Paul is also able to ingest the Water of Life and alter his psyche, although he gains access to his visions of the future as well. He was supposed to be under the Bene Gesserit's control, but due to circumstances, he is not. And he is continually taught and guided by his mother throughout the entire book, even up until the final scene, so she remains a strong presence in his development. The later Dune books explore the consequences of Paul's leadership and his religious war, and the final two books are mainly focused on the Bene Gesserit as the main characters who are fighting a rival all-female group known as the Honoured Matres, who are more like the evil Harkonnen in their operations. So it's a huge book in scale and scope, and I often argue very Machiavellian, very political in its machinations, and it's quite tricky to explain to people what Dune is all about. Just fundamentally, it contains a number of warnings about dangerous heroes, the ecology also being one of the major themes of Dune. And as I said, the Dune books take a very interesting shift in the last two books, and it's often noted that a lot of people drop away from the books at this point, which I think is rather sad. I have to say that in my own mind are the ones that I can remember the least at the minute, just because I've been working on so much other stuff. So I'm quite fuzzy about these things. I have to tell you, by the way, Cara, Babs' well sharp on all of this stuff has been keeping me right as I keep going, what is it in Chapter House Dune? I cannot remember. So sorry about that. A couple of, it's all amateur here, isn't it? Anyway, a couple of phone calls and things like that making noises in the background, but it all is good. So, as you can probably figure out, I could keep talking like this for quite some time. So I'm going to put the first of these questions to Cara and let her chat away. And I suppose the first thing, you've heard me sort of give a bit of a blurb, formal sort of introduction to yourself. Why don't you tell us a wee bit about yourself, actually, Cara, rather than me sort of going through? I think it would come across a bit better, first of all.
About me. So I've been an English major my whole life, and I only got into Dune at the end of my undergraduate degree. Mm-hmm. So I think most people don't get to study science fiction in a traditional classroom, and that was also the case with me. But I really wanted to study my favorite novel, which can be really dangerous, because sometimes when you study something, you get too critical of it, and I was definitely worried about that. But I thought, I think this book can handle scholarly study rather than just enjoying it as a regular reader. And so I first read Dune when I was a teenager, like many people, and I'm not really sure how much I understood of it at the time. I know I really enjoyed it, and that's around the same time that I got into other science fiction and fantasy,
Mm-hmm.
the kind of transformational period in life. And I found the Dune series really interesting and engaging, and so I just ate up the sequels all the way up through Chapter House. And I was really sad that it came to an end and Herbert didn't get to finish the final book, but it was nice that there were 6 books to get to be in that universe.
Mm. It's so sad that he didn't get. I think the one thing that we get all of the not finishing Dune series is we've got endless things to talk about because of that. I think it is genuinely all the speculation that we can come to what might have happened. Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose in terms of science fiction, it's you hardly ever encounter it in the classroom. The only science fiction book I ever encountered in any form of education outside of university was 1984. And that I'll tell a lie, The Time Machine actually as well, but that's it. Just there's
But those are more considered like literature,
I
you know, like
know.
those are kind of like accepted as, you know, more classics. That's a whole debate, but
Oh, I know.
yeah,
I know.
there's certain ones that are allowed to be, you know, considered literature, I think, for people, and then there's ones that are more science fiction-y, that don't get to be in the canon.
Yeah, I still think the one book that everybody tells me is not a science fiction book. I've put this up there. The one book that I keep getting told is 1984, and how can it not be? It's just bizarre. I think it's funny, but I suppose it is interesting what you're saying about science fiction is just not. It's just not really there, is it? And certainly not in this country. It's completely absent. Could you tell us a wee bit more about the book, actually, Cara? Your book's called Women's Agency in the Dune Universe. I've got the full title here somewhere, if I could bear with me a wee second, just to do you proper justice. Tracing Women's Liberation Through Science Fiction. There we go. Could you tell us a wee bit more about what's the main argument and what are the main threads of the book?
Sure. So when I first studied Dune, I just had time or just had enough space in the honors project to look at Jessica. So I always wanted to look more. So for masters, as you said, I was able to expand and look at other characters and look at the Bene Gesserit, but I still didn't have that depth and that scope to be able to look really deeply. And I also wanted to look at all 6 books. So for me, the PhD was really an opportunity to give it justice and look across the series and try to trace threads that start in the first book and then are expanded on or further developed. So, and then for a PhD, you have to add more theory and you have to add more kind of contextualization than you do, say, in at the lower degree levels. And so I decided, well, first of all, I decided to take what scholar William Touponce had written in his 1988 book on Frank Herbert. And he said, whether or not the Dune series is ultimately feminist and the images and voices of women it projects is an open question. And here it was, no one had ever taken up that question to really look at that since the 80s. And so I decided to take that as my kind of focus point, is answering that question. So my argument is really looking at an analysis of the female characters of the Bene Gesserit and looking at how do they align with what was going on in history during the time these books were written, which was a time of great social and cultural change in the US and elsewhere. And I also looked at, are these characters stereotypes or are they more three-dimensional? Do they have complexity? And then also tracing what was going on with women at the time, what was going on with the second wave feminist movement and those kinds of theories. So it was a lot, but I tried to trace these threads in the book and also what was going on in history at the time. And it was hard because you have to separate things into chapters when you write a thesis or you write a book. And so Dune is so interwoven with itself, has so many layers. So I chose 5 main areas that I thought I could pull apart into separate chapters. And so these are the main structure. So the first is what I call the mind-body synthesis, which is a kind of clunky term, but I was just trying to explain this is how women are able to use both the mind and the body in kind of a balance or in harmony with each other to their advantage, rather than just being all about the mind or just being all about the body. They really use both together.
This is the
And then the second focus area was reproduction and motherhood, which are huge topics in women's studies. How women have control over reproduction, what's their role in mothering, how do they guide their offspring, which is a big thing in Dune. And the third thing I looked at was voices. And so this includes physical voice, which Vanity Desert used, and vocal control. It also includes reading someone else's voice to see if they're telling the truth or not. And then it's also looking at what's the number of women's voices in the books. And so this is looking at where do they appear in the main text, where do they appear in the epigraphs that start each chapter. And the fourth thing I looked at was education and memory. And this includes how the Bene Gesserit have a school or have schools and teach young women and girls. And then also how they gain access to women's ancestral memory. And then the final thing I looked at was sexuality. And so this is looking at women's sexual activity, what kind of control, what kind of self-determination they have. So those are the five pieces that I put together as chapters to try to look across the Bene Gesserit and across what they do. So it was a difficult challenge to figure out how to structure it, but that's what I ended up with. And so I used those 5 things to look at what was going on in history, what was going on in feminism, and what's going on in these books.
I totally get what you're saying, but I mean, for anybody who's looked at my own work, what you said is that Frank Herbert has these themes that are so tightly woven together that, and he's actually said this, that if you deliberately try to unwind one, he's decided to make it that hard for you. It's a very, I don't know, it's almost helical set of themes, hard to separate within the Dune series. And as I said, where you got to, I would argue that particularly with the bulk of the stuff that's in your work is in the 2 books at the end, book 5 and book 6 of the Dune series. Excuse me. And it's sometimes described as, I don't know, some people are a bit funny with these 2 books, and I've heard funny descriptions of them in terms of how sex, for example, people have talked about that the Bene Gesserit books are a bit weird in the sex. And things like the sexual imprinting of Duncan Idaho, and etc., etc. And of course, Frank Herbert's famously bad sex scene in the book, which involves, I think, sausages. If I have to say it, it's one of the worst written sex scenes ever. But it is all of this. It's fascinating, I have to say. And the Bene Gesserit are, for those who are not too aware, a fantastic creation, I think. I've got a good question for you later, actually, but I'll keep it till we get to the Q&A. I wanted to ask you something about the Bene Gesserit that I think you can answer. But the Bene Gesserit books are a bit interesting, and they're very much, I suppose, they both in the 80s. We have that development. Frank's work changes, and I think he's changes a good bit as he goes along. In terms of women's agency, just for our audience tonight, could you tell us a little bit about what you mean by that term and how you use it in the book, Cara?
Yeah, so I chose to use the term in the theory of agency rather than power, because it seemed to me like a good way of proving how women are active and influential, even though they don't necessarily have traditional markers of power. So, and I think that's what gets a lot of people caught up, is they look at the Bene Gesserit and they say, oh, well, they're not that powerful, therefore, we don't really need to look any deeper at what's going on there. So a basic definition of agency is the way through which someone exerts power or achieves their goals. And so I took that and I looked at specifically embodied agency, which just means looking at agency in terms of the body. So I focus on the body, and I'm looking at how do women have control over their body? How do they have the ability to actively influence events and outcomes and what's going on around them? So you don't necessarily have to be in a position of power or be a powerful figure to have agency or have embodied agency. And so I use this to look at each of those 5 different areas that I mentioned, such as reproduction. So looking at, is the body an obstacle for women? or is it a way that they can be active and influential in their environment? So that's how I kind of got around the issue of the common critique about the series is, oh, well, the Vanity Desert aren't, kings and queens or emperors, and therefore, they're always inferior. They're always behind the scenes. But actually, you can have a lot of influence and a lot of agency, even if you're not in a traditional place of power. And I think Herbert was very interested in looking at the non-obvious ways that people have influence. And so that's the framework that I use to look at women. I found it more helpful than looking at, do they have equal rights or do they have power? Because that's not the kind of universe that Herbert creates.
No, it's not at all. It's a very good point. I think within the Dune Universe, to me, what was always interesting about it, but in terms of that we have the Bene Gesserit, which is a body, a school of women, if you like, who have complete control, mind and body. At the same time, we've got the Bene Tleilax, one of the big mysteries, quite horrible mystery. Where are all the Bene Tleilax women? And of course, we've got the exact opposite. They have been completely enslaved to the point of turned into reproductive machines. It's one of the things that I just thought was absolutely fascinating about the Dune series, and that you have so many different groups showing so many different ideas. I'll get the question I was wanting to ask you. I was going to ask, but we'll get to it. Actually, it's kind of about that. In terms of let's see, can you tell me a wee bit? Actually, I'm quite fond of feminist science fiction, as Cara would know, but I'm not particularly widely read on it. And I suppose the study of the science fiction feminism I think is particularly interesting. Anything that kind of works towards social change, I think is particularly science fiction seems to be a genre that does that very, very well. Could you tell me a wee bit about the second wave of women's liberation and the feminist movement? You described this as part at the time. Is this, if I haven't got this right, because I'm not very knowledgeable about this, is this kind of work appearing during this second wave of feminism, what would we call it, in America, etc.?
Yeah, so
what would be the first wave? Sorry.
My first wave is the right suffrage, trying to get the right to vote.
Suffragette, yeah.
So that was like 1800s up until usually around World War I is when in the US and the UK and other places. And that's considered first. Well, okay.
First wave, yeah.
The wave definition, not everyone agrees with, but for most people, I think it's helpful. First wave is suffrage, trying to get the right to vote.
Yeah.
And then second wave is, in general, simplified version. It's a movement that began in the 1960s, and women were continuing the fight that had begun in earlier movements, such as, they had the right to vote, okay, but now it's about, well, what next, right? Just getting the right to vote didn't suddenly mean that everything became, great. So they were fighting for equal rights still. They were fighting for representation in government and other places, end to discrimination, stopping treating women like they were inferior. They were fighting for reproductive rights, and just in general, a right to make decisions about themselves and their body and have control, like to sum it up. So it's more complex than we often hear about, as I found when I was reading primary sources of the time. And many of the pieces that I read from the 60s and 70s still have a lot of truth today. Unfortunately, they sound like they could have been written recently with a few tweaks. And so this movement is generally considered to have started in the U.S., I would say, but it also had repercussions around the world and inaugurated other waves of movements as women just demanded more. So we want more, we want to have what everyone else has, and we don't want to be treated unfairly anymore. And so this period interested me because yes, it was happening around the same time as science fiction was going through changes as a genre and when the Dune series was being written. So I see the fact that the Dune series is set in the same universe and is published over 20 years is a really great case study for looking at how one science fiction author changed and developed ideas about women across 20 years when all of this was going on in popular culture. And I actually think because Herbert was researching and writing it before the second wave actually started flourishing, that he anticipated some of the things that women would end up fighting for, like control over the body. You know, he gives that to women in the first book before the feminist movement had really taken off. And I think he should be given credit for that.
Oh, excellent, excellent. Yeah, as we pointed out, I live in a society that's not very good to women at all. We've just been described in one of the local papers as the most dangerous place to be. Northern Ireland is the most dangerous place to be a woman in Europe. So it's another win for us here. And of course, we've had a kind of a cull is the only word to describe it, of female politicians recently. Absolute bunkers, to be honest with you. So as a person who's raised by two women, as I often point out, I'm quite appalled by my own culture and wish they'd read more. I think they could do a reading your book, Cara, to be honest with you. Why do you think the Bene Gesserit aren't handled in a particular way, aren't talked about so much in science fiction, if they're so... I mean, they're fascinating to me, and I think they're fascinating to a lot of people. What is it about? I suppose it's maybe Dune as well, but what's it about the Vanity Desert that... why are they being neglected if they're so important?
Yeah, this is something I think a lot about. I think if we look at other science fiction, it's possible that because the women aren't portrayed as being equal or doing all the same things as male characters, that's one reason. Herbert is very subtle in his work in general, and their abilities and their skills are very understated in the novels, and I think people miss them, if they're not kind of paying attention. There's Taoist elements in the order that could be unfamiliar to readers, certainly unfamiliar to me, that makes them seem more passive. I think there's in the Western culture, we have an idea that, to be strong is to do this, or to be influential is to do this, or is to look this way. And I think they're not that drastically different from real women, because they're still having children, they're still raising children, they're still marrying men. So it might seem like, oh, there's nothing to see here, but I think they're fascinating, and there's a lot to unpack if you get past, again, the idea that they're not in traditional leadership positions. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that someone has a lot of agency. I also think they're not actually religious, but they take on the guise of religion, and I think it's potentially harder for people in our world now, which has become quite secular and individualistic, to grasp the idea that you could be part of a collective or part of a group and give up your own personal desires for a greater good or for the goals of the group. And there's a lot of strategic sacrifice that the Bene Gesserit go through, and I think this rubs up against our notion that you should always think about yourself first as an individual. And we might be seeing a shift with this in terms of response to climate change, which kind of demands more of that collective action rather than thinking of just about yourself. But I think that's one of the challenges is people look at the Bene Gesserit and they say, oh, well, they have to follow the rules of the order, or they have to do something that doesn't go against their own personal wishes. Therefore, they're, being controlled by someone else and they're not very influential, or we should dismiss them. But I mean, there's a lot of groups that ask you once you join to, give up some of your individualistic tendencies or your wishes for the greater good. And so that's potentially another reason why people don't see them as very strong characters.
I think the misconception there is that the Bene Gesserit fundamentally understand that sitting on a throne is the most dangerous place to be. And the desire to create a Kwisatz Haderach, which ultimately is going to be a weapon that they intend to wield, well, they intend to put that Kwisatz Haderach on the throne and stand behind it as it destroys everything in front of it. That is their pretty much intent, regardless of, I think, how the different families are aiming for the throne. The Bene Gesserit's breeding program is lining up with, doesn't really matter who's getting the throne. It's whether it's the Atreides. The Atreides are going for it, the Harkonnens are going for it generationally. Everybody's after the throne, and they're the only people that aren't after it. They're the power behind the throne, which is the real power. And as I said, the nature of power within Dune, a lot of people don't get that. It's they are powerful by not taking the throne. It's the one, and if you think about poor old Shaddam the Fourth, and his 5 daughters, his desire to have a male child has been when you're talking about control over our body, women's bodies, etc., but the desire of a man to have what he wants in terms of his children, no, he doesn't get it. He gets 5 daughters and all the, again, part of the breeding program. I think that's how the Bene Gesserit are particularly clever, smarter than everyone else. As I often said, the only thing that goes wrong for the Bene Gesserit is the thing that goes wrong for everybody in the Dune Universe. It's part of Frank's little subtleties, is that I think, as I put it, everybody who's working with agency, if you like, in the Dune Universe to act on a certain set of ideals or to get a set of goals happening or whatever, they don't realise how these things affect themselves, that ultimately there's feedback. And the point that the failure in the Bene Gesserit thinking is that they don't understand how their breeding program affects them, but it's the one shared fault of everybody in the Dune Universe. Every organisation doesn't really understand long-term consequences or the I suppose there is, the actions that will feed back upon them. I think
they think that they can stand outside of and direct things.
Yeah.
But not be touched themselves, but
yep, they're all wrong. Unfortunately, that's that. Yeah. I often, as you were saying, it's the way I would put it is whenever Frank's working, and you think, look at this. This is the real big problem. There it goes. That's the really danger. The thing you're not paying attention to. I think it's fantastic, and particularly it's one of the main reasons why I love Frank Herbert's work. Is it's the random. He likes to throw in the random, the thing that you'll not see coming, and he likes to have a look at this, have a look, dazzle you, and it's very subtle, I think, and it leads to all sorts of what's going to happen in book 7, I suppose. In terms of your work and your new book, would people need to have read all the 6 Dune books to get this, or would they need to have seen a film, or how accessible would it be to them if they haven't read all 6 Dune books?
So I try to make it accessible. So I have a brief summary of all the books in my introduction chapter, and those summaries really focus on what's important to know about the Bene Gesserit, so they're not a summary of everything that happens. And there is a lot of focus in my book on the first Dune book, because that's where the world building happens. That's where Jessica is introduced to us and where she's developed. And I think she's our main window into the Bene Gesserit for the first part of the series. So there's a lot of focus on her. I do use examples from the later books to show, here's how the order is developing, here's some new abilities that Herbert throws in that they have. But all of these are explained in the context of the chapter focus area. Because I recognize many people haven't made it to the last 2 books, but this is when women take center stage, and then there's a rival all-female group to contrast against the Bene Gesserit.
Yeah, the Honored Mattress.
So it's more of a focus on the first book, because that's where a lot of the good stuff is, and then kind of case study examples from the later books. So you don't have to have read all of the books to understand the ideas, because there's a lot of contextualization that happens in each chapter. That's what I would say.
Excellent. No, as I said, I sometimes I used to look at the Dune books as 2 trilogies, and I don't look at them that way at all anymore. I look at them as a set of 3 sets of 2, if you like. The Dune and Dune Messiah, and then Children of Dune, God Emperor, and then the 2 Bene Gesserit books. And I often I think about, is it Donald E. Palumbo? Who are we talking about? Aye, with the chaos theory.
No, the monomyth.
Yeah, and the reiteration of action and so on. And I've often that's why I spend so much time thinking about what the 7th book would have been like. And as I said, it's the Bene Gesserit are heading, they're driving all of pretty much the action, and particularly how things evolve in the Dune universe, and it's just such a cliffhanger. No. And I think a lot of us, not to offend anybody in the Brian Herbert, Kevin J. Anderson camp, I think a lot of us are deeply dissatisfied with the conclusion to Dune. I've never seen so many Deus Ex Machinas in one book. I'm quite impressed, actually. I think 5 or 6 at the end. Totally impressive, How does the Dune series and the depiction of women fit into the broader history of science fiction?
Yeah, so this is another contextualization that I do in the book. Again, simplifying, but in general, science fiction has been classified by scholarship into broad categories or trends.
Mm-hmm.
So there's Golden Age, which is 1940s up until around 1960, which is kind of your classic Asimov stories. Then there's the New Wave, which Dune fits into from the 60s and the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And then usually around the 1980s is when we get like cyberpunk, kind of like The Matrix is based off of Neuromancer. So not everything fits into these neat groupings, but those are kind of general trends of the change. And feminist science fiction really took off, as you would expect, around the same time as the feminist movement in the 60s and 70s. So you had stories like only having women in the story, or having women and men living in separate societies and, you know, fighting each other or being rivals, or some kind of conflict between those. There was stories that talked about babies being born in artificial environments and having non-nuclear families raising them. You know, that was something that women were, you know, kind of experimenting and writing about. And so they were looking at gender, sexism, and oppression in new ways, is pretty much what feminist science fiction was all about. And they were also speculating about what might society look like in a different future. You know, what if this weren't true, or what if this obstacle were removed for women? So looking at Dune, so Dune has been previously considered to be the start of the modern period of science fiction, and this is when it kind of started moving and becoming more complex and having more literary nature and more widespread popularity beyond just a small minority of fans. So around the same time the Star Trek was coming out, and things were exposing more people to this genre. So what I say in the book is that Dune should be recognized for its depiction of women, especially coming out early in the 60s, and that it has several similarities to feminist science fiction, and it gives women a lot of skills and abilities that were beyond what was currently possible, and still is currently possible. And so that's how I situate Dune in that. It's part of the new wave. It had some, you know, becoming more literary, but it also did some really cool things with the female characters, and it should be recognized as that, even if it doesn't look the same as other feminist science fiction of the period.
Yeah, I mean, I've always considered it, especially with the involvement of Bev, Herbert, Frank's wife. I think within the, you know, that's actually what I was going to ask you, but I'll keep it for you. But I wanted to ask you I'll talk to you a bit about it later. We've got another wee question but it was just about Bev's input. I'm very curious to know if you know anything about that. I understand that Bene Gesserit, a lot of her is in them, if you know what I mean. Frank Herbert's wife. I'm often wondering how much did he turn to her, or how much is his own, if you see what I mean. Just in terms of our formal questions to get us through that, what do you think people would find most interesting for Dune fans from your book?
So I think people will be interested in looking at the series from this new perspective, and especially the historical perspective of what was happening with women in American society around the same time, as opposed to how we might look at it today or how it might have been viewed at the time. I know lots of people have read Dune and they didn't see anything special about the Bene Gesserit, or they thought, oh, they're just working behind the scenes. And as I said, I didn't think much about the Eastern elements like Taoism or other ways of perceiving the world before I started researching it. And I think another thing that I do is I compare the Bene Gesserit with some of the other groups or other characters like the Mentats and the Bene Tleixiu, and these other groups have really hardly been looked at all. And so I put them up against each other to draw some comparisons and some contrast that I found were interesting, because I think looking at them in relationship with other characters can really help highlight this is what Herbert was trying to show, or this is a theme that comes across in terms of how they work versus how some of the male characters work.
Interesting. What was I thinking? Oh, so I had a train of thought there, and I've just lost it. But I'll tell you what. I'll go to the next question. What are your plans for your next works on Dune?
Great. Yeah. So I have a couple chapters on the Bene Gesserit. They're similar topic, but a little bit different in terms of focus, and those will be coming out in edited collections that have other people's works in the next couple of years. My big project is I'm finishing up a second book on Dune, and that's going to be more of a general guidebook to just the first book for general audiences as well as students studying at university. And again, just like this book, it was hard to choose which areas do you focus on, what's most important to talk about when you have limited space. But I'm hoping it all comes together and really gives an interesting introduction to how the book has really stood the test of time, and that it really still has a lot to offer modern audiences. It's not just a classic that used to be. It's still something that has a lot of new things to give and can be read in a new way, in the 21st century.
Well, I agree. I think it's interesting that Dune has longevity. I think a lot of science fiction books do not, and I think the main problem for a lot of readers is that I think science fiction arguably is about the now rather than the future. And whenever we move forward a bit, we tend to, when we look back at older science fiction, we understand that now didn't happen, and that it's not real, and so some science fiction tends to almost be seen as fantasy. I mean, is Gulliver Jones? Those, or hang on, who am I thinking of? The Mars stories, the Edgar Rice Burroughs things. Those kind of things have dated quite badly. And I suppose the ideas from them came on as Lovell's observations of canals on Mars, which turned out to not be true, etc. So some science, I don't read it that way at all. I'm very happy to put myself back in that time and read science fiction as if it's contemporary. But a lot of people can't do that, and therefore sometimes it just seems dated or antiquated. And that there's something about Dune that it has this kind of dated, antiquated feel because of the Butlerian jihad. If you see what I mean, that it sometimes it can have the feel of something like out of the Arabian Nights, almost, almost like a fantasy story. And also because it's unfinished, I think that's why. I also think that's gives it great longevity. As I said, I'm a person that enjoys reading a lot of ancient literature, and loads of it's unfinished. It's fragmented. There's bits missing here, bits missing there, and that's kind of what I really like about it, because you get to go, there's no finite ending to some of these things, and I have to say it is a book. I mean, I don't know, I've lost track of how many times I've read Dune now, and as I point out to people, I find I get quite hard pressed to come back to the books because I've read them so much. But this is kind of the end of our formal questions, but I will just say this to you, that myself and Cara have agreed on one thing, and we chatted about this, that whenever you do a PhD, they say you should do it on something you love, but that you'd probably hate it by the time you've finished it. And we both discussed this, that it's not the case. We both still, love the source material, and it hasn't driven us mad. And that we're both quite happy to return to Frank Herbert's Dune Universe, as much as my main problem is I've got lots of other things to read. Excuse me. And it does, Frank Herbert's he's not a small read. There's plenty, as I said, it takes you a wee while to get through it, but it is, having just read the first Dune book again recently for the film, I loved it, and I still think it's a very tightly written book. I just don't see it as being able to age well at all, in people's imaginations. I think it'll stay fresh for a long time, I have to say. But I just always find that interesting that I've talked to a lot of people who've done PhDs and certain things, and they don't ever want to look at it again. They're done. Leave me alone. It was a nightmare, this kind of thing. And just to say that we both really enjoyed our work and looking at these books in a particular way. So thank you very much, Cara. I hope we didn't make too much of a hash of this. This is our first attempt at these things, and we're all a bit informal and a bit doolally here, as I like to say. I've got a whole ton of comments and stuff over here. So if you don't mind, I'll open things up a wee bit to our audience. And see what
it sounds like there's some people are having some issues with the streaming. But
well, we're all good. We've been running live. There is a wee bit of a delay, but let's see. I'm just going to back up here. So for everybody who's been chatting away, I'll just back up and read through a few of the comments, and we can take a pause whenever we get to a question if we see. So let's just see. We'll go through. This is what we usually how we interact with people here. So we've got everybody so excited. Something that's just Babs's connection in Ohio. Babs's connection dies quite a bit, I think. So we have Marcia Bideman saying happy book launch, Cara, and Mika. I need to bring this closer. These glasses aren't cutting it. Let me just see. So that's Mika CG says, hi Cara, super excited for you. So we got a bunch of greetings here. Must be on my end, says Babs. There we go. Tales from the Throne World by Hilary S. Webb, PhD, says, love your background, Cara. People says, yay, Cara, you get lots of love here tonight, Cara. There we go. By the way, folks, if any of you do have any questions for myself or Cara, type away now. Now's the time, and we'll do our best to answer them if we can. Just reading through a few more comments. So we've got Marsha says, so glad to be with you for this, Cara. Marsha Jacobson. Karen Rule says, so happy to be here for your book launch. So hope I'm not mispronouncing anybody's names, by the way, folks, and I hope you don't mind my Northern Irish accent too much. Bams Bells, wow, look, it's just ladies watching. There we go. Dal says, congrats, Cara. Congrats, Cara. Way to go from Colin Bjork. Bams Bells, dang dog, you give me some new warm fuzzies here, whatever that means. From Babs. Victoria No says, congratulations, Cara. Joseph Smith, Jin fan, congrats. Goodness gracious, we got lots of love here tonight. Karen Ruel says, congrats. Babs Bilo, not sure I'd consider 1984 a science fiction novel. Ooh, well, that's one for another time, Babs. Stephen Campbell, hi Stevie, hi Doc, hi Cara, hi Alts, hi Stevie. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for the chat earlier, sir. Much appreciated. Cynthia Greenman says, I'm so excited for you, Cara. Congratulations. Howdy to you too. Such a good way to describe it. Okay, Doc Sloan. Thanks for being an ally. Oh, okay. From Marcia. Okay, Doc Sloan! Exclamation mark. Thanks for being an ally of women. No problem at all. as much as we've discussed this, my basic philosophy for anybody who doesn't know me online is I come from lots of different backgrounds. I'm a classicist and a computer scientist and a philosopher and a linguist, etc., etc. But my main philosophy in life is isonomia, which is what most people pretend to call their democracies. Isonomia is what democracy should be, and it simply means equal law for everyone, for all. And I suppose that's feminism as well, isn't it? So that's my philosophy. But thank you very much, Marcia. Absolutely, you don't need to thank me for being an ally of women. It's just seems a natural thing to me. Brad Rose, yep, safer to be a kingmaker than a king. Absolutely. Congratulations, says Christine Yard. Carol Blessing, are others having problems with the streaming continuously rebooting, or is it just my end? There might be a bit of a bother here. I'm not too sure, Carol. Everything seems to be running fine here, but we have a bit of a lag, and this is the first time we've ever actually done this. So Cara sort of got plenty of warnings that it might all go in which case we've been hopefully recording it and we would get it all to you anyway. We are going to be putting some links, etc., for Cara's book in the description. Once we put this feedback up on the station, it'll be staying there permanently, and we'll get that updated with information for the book. And I think I'll get Cara to tell us a bit about it in a wee second, just as I finish these last wee comments. Christine, Cara, my phone is buffering a lot, but that may be just where I am. Congratulations, Cara. Yeah, it seems the feed is doing better now. There we go. So that's us caught up to date with those comments. If anybody does have a wee question for us, fire away. And we've got about a minute delay, I think, but we'll definitely do our best to answer them. What I was going to ask you actually, Cara, well, just if you don't mind, I've always been curious about this. What could you, if you know anything about it, do you know much about Beverly Herbert's input into the creation of the Vanity Desert, or could you tell me a little if you do know?
Yeah, I did try to find this out. I didn't put a biographical perspective in this book because there just wasn't room, and it's hard, and you get into death of the author kind of things. But I have been looking at it now for the second book, and there's vague references to her helping review manuscripts, and she would type them up and kind of feed suggestions. And Brian Herbert, their son, has commented that she helped Herbert out with aspects of characterization, particularly the motivational aspects of female characters. And I think it's one of those cases, as with many writing couples, Bev was also a writer, that we're never going to know exactly how much of her is in his work, but I would say based on the characters that we can see and based on the Vanity Desert, there's definitely a strong influence from her as well as his 10 maternal aunts who really wanted him to be go through Catholic education. And I think you can see those strong women in your life kind of coming through this book. Now, of course, that doesn't always happen. There's other writers who have strong female influences and don't put that in their book, but I can't see how that wouldn't have affected Herbert's writing. And I think Herbert has alluded to Bev as the White Witch in an interview, and I think we can see Lady Jessica as being modeled off of her in terms of, you know, a motherly figure who's also, you know, has a very strong will and knows exactly what's going on and gives her that three-dimensionality that you don't see in a lot of other science fiction. And that for me is part of why Dune has stood the test of time, is because the characters are well developed, or at least some of them, and they're interesting, and we get to be inside their heads, and they have motivations and they have struggles, and they're not just kind of there so that you can learn about the technology, because Herbert wasn't really interested in the technology. He was interested in humans and how do humans work, and how do we think, and how do we process stuff, and that's rare. That's rare to you know, to have go inside, you know, female characters' heads, especially at that time, and have a realistic person come out of it who doesn't just seem really, you know, like she is based on archetypes. He did use archetypes in his work, but he took the archetypes as a starting place. I think he didn't end at the archetype. He started with the archetype and drew it out and fleshed it out more.
Yeah, he uses Jungian mandalas as well, and but he's heavily invested in his archetypes. And I think Alia is a character that fits into so many of them. You know, but you know, was it the heart virgin part of the syzygy, this kind of thing. I'll give you. Oh, tell you what. Sorry, Cara, I've got a question for you here, and much as I don't want to hog this actually here. So here's apparently I'm mispronouncing some people's names. We'll have a wee call. Just say here. So we're going to. I do apologise, folks. I wish I knew how to do it correctly. Karen Ruel, I hope that's not too bad. Karen says, "What's your next favourite science fiction book, series, or author?"
Oh, that's a hard question.
They're telling me they like my accent though. So after Dune, what would it be? It is a tricky one, isn't it? There's Keith Hall saying, "Greetings, hi Keith, thanks for joining."
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I do. I probably would say more fantasy than sci-fi.
Just a favourite book after Dune, then, I suppose.
You can have no other favorite book once you go to.
I disagree. I think you can.
I like the Golden Compass, Philip Pullman's the Golden Compass,
yes.
Which they recently made into a TV series. I really like that. I read that around the same time as Dune, and I really like that. I have been meaning to reread it as an adult. Haven't had a chance to.
Well, you've read
there's also a lot of layered themes and dealing with religion and that kind of religious order.
Yeah.
It's more obvious,
isn't it? I think. I've only read it as an adult, I have to say, but I got lots of Milton in it, I think. But I find it hard to comprehend it as a children's book. I think, well, I guess it's that struggle of kind of being a young person who's misunderstood, and you know, as they usually do, they have to go on a journey, and there's some issue with the parents. Like they're all, a lot of them follow that line, and it just, when you're feeling like that as a young person, I think it's comforting to kind of read about other people are at least getting out and getting to explore, even if you're not. For myself, I don't know. I'm a bit like yourself. I don't like favourites. I kind of have a lot of my favourite books are very, very old. But
Ian Banks is also more modern science fiction I really like.
Yeah, I actually, there you go. We've both come up with it. Well, my favourite set of stories outside the Dune, probably the culture books today. prior to that, I don't know, I would have said probably Dan Simmons' Hyperion Cantos or Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, something like that. But otherwise, my favourite book would be The Anabasis, probably. There you go, by Xenophon. So I like a good march up country. But books like that read like a fantasy book to me. Well, I think to me they read like Greek civilization, but to other people I think they would read like fantasy novels, you know. Marcia Biederman, I don't know which Marcia, it could be Marcia, I'm so sorry. You're mispronouncing my name, but I'm enjoying your accent. That's okay then, we're not too bothered. Keith saying, we've got a question from Carol Blessing. Why do you think Herbert chose to have Jessica have a male child rather than only featuring females? Does that show Bene Gesserit influence on males as well as females?
Yeah, this is always the question, right? Like that comes up where people say, "Oh well, but Jessica had a boy, and so therefore, you know, showing boys are better. Why the Quetzalcoatl had to be a male?" There's kind of different threads to this. There's looking at the medieval kind of feudal culture or the environment and the setting, is that primogeniture, males being preferred in terms of having heirs, right? You mentioned the emperor is deprived of having a male heir by the Bene Gesserit, which leaves open the possibility of a certain alliance with one of the daughters.
To the throne,
and
yeah.
so I think it makes sense within the setting that Leto would want to have a male to carry on the male line, right? So that's kind of just like how the society was. And Herbert was also really interested in the Jungian and the kind of masculine and feminine,
yes,
kind of as the yin and yang and the dual.
the syzygy.
So
yeah.
But the thing is, he's not consistent with, only females can only do this and males can only do this. And you know, even when Jessica's going through the really dangerous water of life ceremony, the other Reverend Mother says this would have been fatal to a male fetus. So there's kind of sometimes the male is considered stronger, but then sometimes the female is considered stronger. And people usually would just look at the examples of the male and they'll kind of dismiss or forget about the other times when Herbert shows the female is actually being stronger in different circumstances. So, and looking outside the text, what was Herbert interested in? He was interested in looking at, why do people follow these leaders, these messiah figures? And in our history, well, I'd say Western history, it's mostly been, well, pretty much always males, right? It's like Lawrence of Arabia or the prophets out of Islam, prophets out of Christianity and Judaism, right? So he could have put a female there, but I don't think it would have worked for what he was trying to show. He was trying to show the danger in heroes, and you know, up until that time, also today, you know, it would most likely be a male figure that would be kind of going in that way. But yeah, her follow-up question, does that show Bene Gesserit influence on males as well as females? So what I talk about in my book is, yes, sometimes they have males for whatever reason, you know, and we can argue about whether that's a good idea. But when they have male children, they then raise them Bene Gesserit, right? And they raise them to think in their ways and to act in their ways. Even when Paul rejects them, he's still a product of that upbringing, right? He can't ever get rid of pretty much being a Bene Gesserit and understanding and thinking in that way. And so to me, that really is a sign of the mothering that happens. It's not just about reproduction and the breeding program. It's also about how do you mother those children once they come into the world. And they're mothered by Bene Gesserit women who craft and mold them according to, you know, that order. And if we look at biographically, Herbert was, you know, raised by all these women and all these aunts, and he went to Jesuit education. Even though he rejected Catholicism in terms of practicing, he could never escape that upbringing and that education, as I think a lot of us can relate to, right? Like how you're raised when you're little, even if you know as an adult, hey, that doesn't make sense anymore, or hey, I don't really agree with that, it imprints on you in a way that you can never be rid of. And so that's what the Bene Gesserit influence is. Once you are part of that, you can't ever become not part of it, even if you reject being controlled by them or reject obeying those orders. So that for me it's more complicated than just, yes, she did out of love, but she also wanted to have the Quizzakaterak, you know, she had her own selfish reasons as well that I think people don't talk about. And you have to read that dialogue that she has with the Reverend Mother, because she says, you know, this is about your selfish desires. And Jessica has that pride, you know, I think that I could do this.
Yeah.
And yeah.
It's funny.
That's not just a woman kowtowing to male society. There's more going on there.
It's the famous quote from Gorgo, isn't it? That only Spartan women produce Spartan men. If you see what I mean, only Spartan women produce Spartan warriors. I used to say only Northern Irish women produce Northern Irish terrorists as well. But there you go. But it's particularly the Miles Tegg character, I think, I think that's probably the strongest thing I remember from is that you have the Bene Gesserit, you know, at this point, but they've got this general, this Bashar, who's a man, and you kind of go, oh, why? What's that about? Why not one of them as a general? And as you say, it's a man who's raised Bene Gesserit. He thinks Bene Gesserit, you know. And maybe it's also got something to do with, well, yeah, we'd rather be behind, send a man out to do the fighting. I'm not quite sure, but it's I think it is a very interesting point, and we sometimes talk about this. Particularly, it's a thing I think in Hollywood, the idea of what a strong woman is. And we've talked about what strong female characters are in literature. It's nothing to do with, you know, or shooting and blowing things up like the guys. It's not that kind of strength. It's you know, and when I talk about strong characters, they're fleshed out, they're real as the men. They stand out, they're vibrant. That's a strong character to me. The idea that strong women have to be, you know, I don't know if I think that's
to be men.
Idea. Yeah, well, that's a good way of putting it.
Have to be masculine. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's often the same thing to do with power. To be honest, I think the nature of power is very much sometimes, depending on how we look at it, a very much a male thing, and I often found it a wee bit funny. Maybe, you know, we used to talk about, was it the Spice Girls with girl power, and I thought, okay, girl power. What do you mean by that? Do you want to go out and oppress people the same way the men do? It's that, you know, in terms of government and this kind of thing. And I just thought, no, power's not the thing. You know, it's power corrupts absolutely. What was it Herbert said? Power. He said something like, it doesn't corrupt; it merely attracts the corruptible. Something like that, I think. Yeah. You know, I have a few more comments here, Cara. I'll just read through them here as we were getting there. Let's see, because.
Yeah, I think. I mean, it's not necessarily fleshed out in Dune, but in Dune Messiah, and I don't know if Herbert just kind of changed his mind on this, but you can see that it kind of seems like Alia could have become a Quizzakaterak because she is able to tap into some prescience, you know, and she has struggles with her identity because of you know, Jessica taking the water of life when she did, but it's not as, I guess when I was researching for that section in the book, it was not as cut and dry as I initially thought of who has access to prescience and who doesn't. It's a bit murky, and so it's possible that the Bene Gesserit were wrong and it didn't have to be a male, but that's potentially something that Herbert came to later, or again, one of those ambiguities in the text.
I think Alia's the character that presents so many problems there. That's to me is probably one of the most interesting characters in the whole series. I think Alia's an amazing character, and I think because we see her transition from hero to villain almost, but the whole nature of her other memory is and of course we have this personality of the Baron Harkonnen contained in her mind, and that just raises, oh, okay, what's he doing there? Why is it a male? If this is meant to be from her other memory, and you know, the idea that personalities come to the fore and take over a personality, what's he doing there? She only has the female other memory. And we've discussed this. We've had some really incredible responses to this. That the Baron was a hermaphrodite. All sorts of things. It's just to try and logically make sense of it. And as you say, Frank doesn't really explain everything, and you know, I think there are wee threads that were just a wee bit lost on, I think, sometimes. But I think Alia's character in particular, it's hard to sort of, and it's meant to be a kind of, it is a syzygy with Paul, that they're meant to be this kind of Apollo and Artemis, the sun and the moon, that this almost divine representations of, and that of course links into their dad being called Leto. But I find something I was going to ask you actually about some of the female characters. I'll read a couple of these wee comments first, but I'll maybe actually. So I'll tell you what, I'll say this first. Do you think some of the female characters are just abandoned in the Dune series, just dropped?
Like Margot Fenring.
Well, the one I was thinking of was Ganima as well. Whereas Alia should be an equal to Paul, Ganima should be an equal in a sense to Leto II. And as much as we all love the God Emperor of Dune, I was really gutted when I read it to find that she wasn't there. That she might have gone along on this journey with him or something. But it was to me the really fast. That's the Margot Fenring. Is it the last we see her? Is that she's headed off? Possibly, if I can't remember, but she's left. She pregnant with Fade Ruth's child. I believe that's the whole point of going to see the Baron on. That's the backup for the line, isn't it? I think it's fascinating. But as I said, Ali and Margot Fenring, what a character, and it's her and Hazimir, her husband, just turn up, and I think they're two of the most interesting characters in the whole Dune series, and we get to see so little of them. And if anybody doesn't know what we're talking about, whenever you get to the final confrontation in Dune, Fade Ruth is not really the danger. It's Hazimir Fenring, who's seen as a potential Kwisatz Haderach, isn't it? He's a genetic eunuch, I believe, and that's why he's not. But and of course him and his Bene Gesserit wife, that they're a very interesting couple. And I often thought, if I can remember correctly, I don't remember much about these books, but when Miles Tegg talks about his parents, I think, is it Losky Tegg and Janet, maybe getting the name wrong, Roxburgh, is it? I often get a mental picture of Hazimir and Margot Fenring whenever he's talking about it. They seem almost like I said, we lose these characters early on, but I think sometimes Frank Herbert likes to come back to things, and of course he's well known for bringing back dead characters. I will run through. We're running a wee bit ahead here, Cara, so I'll just go back up with a few of the comments and questions because they were just following on. We have a bit of dialogue in here. Let's see. So Carol was saying yes, but Herbert could have written it differently, and Babs was felt the possibilities of this child being the Kwisatz Haderach as she told Boheme on Paul's test day. So we're just running a few wee comments here, Cara. I see your point, but a girl child could never be the Kwisatz Haderach. Carol's saying, yes, my point is that feminism has to do more than influence women. Karen Real saying, perfect. I think was that about possibly about my pronunciation. Say to people, pronunciation's a guide. I have to say, there's a lot of arguments about how to pronounce Kwisatz Haderachs and all sorts of things online. As I point out, how you pronounce things entirely depends on the shape of your mouth, if you've got any teeth, all sorts of factors. You just can't make people say certain things, we've got a wee comment here, Cam saying, yes, Pullman is fabulous. I've got the last, no, it's not the last book, probably. I've got the little, it's a very small, short book with a little map and stuff in it. I can't remember, I haven't read it yet. But I read the first three, the original Historic Materials series. Was anyone, let's see, Marshall Jacobson saying, was anyone writing anything similar at the same time he started Dune?
In terms of scale, J.R.R. Tolkien was the only one really, I think, attempting or did write a long kind of epic, but that was in fantasy. But so Dune is considered the kind of equivalent in science fiction in terms of world building. Yeah. And it's when you read Dune and then you read kind of some other things that were coming out at the same time. I mean, to me, there's just no comparison in terms of what Herbert was doing, and I think that's why, of all science fiction, you can safely consider Dune as literature because it has the markings of literature, and it is very ambitious and it's very complex, and it's not a very simple story that you can quickly summarize and move on to the next thing, like some stories. But it did influence. So the success of Dune then after it showed people, hey, we could write something that's super long in science fiction, or we could focus more on this. And even though we don't necessarily know, all of the influence it had, it certainly helped pave the way for other more complex science fiction and longer science fiction and those kinds of things. But at the time, it was fairly unique, I believe. I mean, it had to be serialized in multiple installments. It was so long. No one really wanted to touch it because it was so long. But now we're just used to, science fiction and fantasy books being very long.
God, I'm sick to death. And there's trilogies of trilogies. It's the main thing that drove me away from fantasy literature. I would also say, and I don't know the publication on this date, but generally, for anybody who's watching, we consider Dune the pinnacle of science fiction, whether it's to be able Lord of the Rings of fantasy, or high fantasy, if you like. There is another book within the middle sphere, and I'll go with gothic fantasy, if you like, but Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast trilogy. And I'm not too sure of the dates, but I think he's probably a bit earlier. And interestingly enough, I think Peake's one of the... I did a bit of work on him recently, I just mentioned him, but Peake is one of those guys that I think is a phenomenal writer. And, it's just regardless of the story, I mean, Titus Groan kind of finishes before its protagonist is 2 years old. But by God, can that man write? I think he was not liked by a lot of certain class of writers, and I think he was slagged off. I think I'm talking about what's his name? Is it Mark Amos? Kingsley Amos, New Maps of Hell, possibly. And I remember not liking this, but particularly slagging off Mervyn Peake. Mervyn Peake was adored by the New Wave, and I don't think he lived particularly long, but and I don't know too much about him. I think he did a bit of kids writing. But if anybody hasn't caught the Gormenghast trilogy, I would say Dune, Gormenghast trilogy, Lord of the Rings fit well together. But there's as in the peaks of that kind of fiction, but one's sci-fi. I don't know what to call Gormenghast. I'd call Lord of the Rings high fantasy if you want. It's kind of somewhere in between the gothic fantasy, excuse me, and maybe a little bit of science fiction. I think I was giving off a bit about it the other week, Cara, because the BBC did a radio production of it a long time ago, and Steerpike was played by Sting. Way back around the early 80s when Sting's acting abilities weren't. Excuse me, that's so hot. I'm going to take a wee sip of the precious fluids here. That's an ongoing joke in the station. If you can identify the film, well done. You've got to protect your precious fluids. Okay. Just a wee call. Let's see. I wonder why the bat. So that was Marsha asked that wee question. Thank you, Marsha. Bob's saying I often wonder why the Vanity Desert.
You can tell Herbert's very interested in reproduction. It comes in different forms throughout the whole series, so I wasn't able to cover everything, but yeah, he seemed very, very interested in genetics and that reproduction and actually becomes quite dominant by the end in terms of the Talaxu. So it's interesting how he makes that a major theme that hasn't really been looked at that much in the scholarship.
When I had a wee look at it, I was sort of looking at evolution as the dominant theme that would lead to the sex and gender chapter. That's why kind of my work is cut at the midpoint almost, to set up the major themes that lead into the lesser ones, and not that they're lesser, and sometimes I think they're quite well intertwined. And people would argue that ecology is meant to be one of the major themes of Dune, but it's pretty much dies out by the time you get through God Emperor of Dune. Once you get to the Vanity Desert books, the ecology message is kind of gone. And that's why I went with evolution as the dominant theme, because it's there from the beginning and it's right there at the very end, Let's just have a wee look. I remember the Vanity Desert didn't go to Fade and Alia to get what they sought according to their plan, says Babs. That's a good one. Sorry, I'll read that a wee bit later. Babs was saying, it was in relation to another comment there at Brad, I often wonder why the Bene Gesserit didn't Gola, Fade and Alia to get what they sought according to their plan. quite an interesting comic. With enough golas running about. That, the one thing I noticed in terms of reproduction, as I recall, I think it's in Dune Messiah where Paul offers them. I think he offers the Bene Gesserit his DNA, is it? But it's to be done by artificial insemination or something like that. And the Bene Gesserit have an absolutely no. Isn't that correct? I'm wondering if I'm remembering right.
Yeah, they. It's not until the very end that they finally are kind of forced into having to do artificial. They're really not interested in it.
Yeah, I think that's to do with, as you say, control over their own bodies. If you know what I mean, and that idea, I suppose. I suppose they're all after his DNA at that point. It makes me wonder why they didn't just pop into Caladan when he left and picked up his hairbrush or something like that. We know Paul Atreides has got great hair, don't we? It seems to become a dominant trait of the character. Let me just see here. Goals are fertile. Let's see. Okay, I've missed a few here. So we have Carol saying Octavia Butler has had a surge in popularity. Octavia Butler is one of the authors I haven't read yet, but know quite a bit about. I'm dying to get near some of her books. It's good, I suppose, living in modern times. A lot of science fiction has been quite hard to get in Northern Ireland for a long time. Marcia Jacobson saying, so sorry, I have to leave for a meeting. This was so interesting, congratulations. And then somebody mentioned that Gola came from the dead, so they needed child first. As a yes. So we have a wee bit of banter going here. Let me see. Bene Gesserit no doubt would make circumstances just such a sure, successful meeting between the two. Mike S. says, Jessica may have been selfish by getting overly caught up in her order's own Kool-Aid, but the ultimate goal of the Kwisatz Haderach myth program is far worse, as it seeks to dominate the universe. In fact, there's a good point. I'll throw this one at you, Cara. In the appendices, as what Mike's saying, the whole point of the Kwisatz Haderach is kind of Zeus's desire to rid the world of his heroes. It's to renew the human race by war. And what was I thinking there? Let me get up in the... Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Oh, the appendices. And I don't know what you think about this. I think we maybe chatted about it. I wonder if you've got any opinions on it. In the appendices of Dune, there's a comment about, and it's about what we were talking about earlier, that the Bene Gesserit had failed to see how their own breeding program had affected them. And it's a comment about their failure in the Arrakeen matter. And it states, I must get this out sometime, that the Bene Gesserit's breeding program is not their program and it belongs to someone else. You any thoughts on who?
Well, it says it mentions like a higher plan that they were unaware of. I think that might be just Herbert being cryptic, because the Talaxu had not been entered the picture at that point.
Yeah.
And it's possible it's commentary on, even when you think you have everything figured out and you've got all your the best laid plans go astray. You can do all the planning you want, but chance and different circumstances will lead to your plans changing. Or, he was wanting to look at randomness. Right? Like, we need to have some kind of random chance. We need to have something that is not just completely planned everything out, because that's just not workable. But of course, we have to have the Bene Gesserit lose control for there to be some kind of narrative, because if everything were working according to clockwork, then it probably wouldn't be very interesting.
That'd be dull as hell, wouldn't it? I often just think, I like to just think it's just, that's where I'll go with it and just leave. But it's one of those things that I often wonder what people speculate about, if they've actually noticed this. As you've commented, a lot of people don't read the last two Dune books. A lot of people stop at Dune as well, but a lot of people I've discovered don't read the appendices of Dune. And we're talking, there's a little mini story in there as well, which I think is quite sad for people who miss it. Karen Rule says, sorry, got to run, this was great. And Babs has got a question for you. Question for Cara. What do you think of the gender swap of late kinds in Denis Villeneuve's movie?
Oh, yes. I think I like the idea and the concept of introducing more women of color. That's totally fine. For this particular character, and I don't know if they were intending to do this anyway, but I didn't get the strong sense that Kynes is a scientist. And so to me, that was a loss of an opportunity to show a woman scientist. And the movie overall didn't have a strong ecology or environmental theme. And so Kynes, to me, felt like one of the locals, one of the Fremen, and that's why she knew about the desert. But we didn't get to see Kynes explaining, I mean, really beyond what was, a little bit, we didn't get to see kind of explanations of how the Fremen take water from the dead, like at the banquet scene, or Kynes refusing to spill water because it just goes against his principles. You just don't waste water, even if a new duke who's very powerful comes, you just don't. And kind of getting to see sort of you see a little bit of it, but the kind of the trance that he goes into when Jessica talks about the, keeping the observatory or the place with all the lush plants, keeping that in trust for the people of Arrakis. Like, we don't get to see all those kind of interactions, and then the ending, Kynes' ending, we don't get to see that kind of realization about scientists being wrong. And when you read Herbert's interviews about what Kynes was supposed to be as a character in terms of ecology, it's that you can be a scientist and think you have everything figured out, just like the Bene Gesserit, but actually, here you are on the sand, and there's a spice flow coming up underneath you, and you've just told the Fremen to accept this young hero, and you're not going to be around to guide the shape and path of this hero, and he just realizes what he's unleashed upon this planet.
Yeah.
And none of that comes through in the character. So it's whether or not the Fremen would have accepted a woman in that kind of position. It's kind of also part of it. So there's lots of facets where I think problematic that people thought that you could just substitute anybody, really for any character, could just be swapped around, and you lose something of some of the deeper messages of the book in doing that. Even though I really enjoyed seeing a woman of color, in that kind of role, but it's like what they did with it was, kind of wasn't able to do as much as I would have liked, I suppose.
Brad's just got a follow-on question. He says, following Babs's question about the gender swap of Liet Kynes, it says, following Bab's question about how she died, as in Liet Kynes, I remember Doc, that's me, saying it was a home goal. Cara, what is your perspective? What Brad's talking about is that I considered the whole Liet Kynes character, the gender swap, everything about it was a sort of own goal for feminism by a man. I think, and I jokingly pointed out that the character gets 2 phallic deaths, and that almost any other character could have been gender swapped. And in terms of Liet Kynes, just the sheer impact on the story, particularly for the things that you've pointed out, the banquet scene, the garden that's set in trust, that's almost a lesson on what are they called? Is it the chromatic plastics that they use that change colour during the day and night, and how they gather water. There's so many ecological lessons there. If the character had stayed true to the real character, I don't think we would have made any difference. But I think any other character, arguably apart from maybe Paul or Jessica, could have been gender swapped, and if we want to get that kind of balance of female representation into the film. But in terms of how, as I said, it was done by a man, written by a man. My point of view was that I thought this is one of the strongest characters in literature. What are you doing? And the whole idea, the impression I got is they want to make Jessica stronger. And I thought that they did the opposite. But in terms of, I suppose that I just thought it was quite funny that instead of dying the way the character should do, with that moment of realization on the spice blow, etc., we have the character stabbed by a man, and then up comes the worm, and we don't get to see the whole worm. And I just thought that's two phallic symbols right there. A sword and a worm. So Brad's just wondering what that's what we were talking about from this discussion we've had. And I just thought it was a bit of an own goal. I thought it was a bit stupid if we could done it any other way. But
well, they also make Leah a lot more kind of under the thumb of the Emperor. You know, just lines about, you know, the Emperor commands me to see nothing and say nothing. It just they kind of neutralize the kind of rebellious nature of Liette. Like, I'll pretend that I'm working for the Imperium, but actually everything I'm doing is against that. So
it's there's a
kind
lot
of, kind of tying her hands behind her back. I guess it felt like that's the character, like, wasn't able to do much except just save, to kind of save them at the end.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I thought the actress was really impressive, but to me, it's what's missing from the character. And especially, I think it's going to have a lot of consequences for the story. The one thing that I said was that I hope that it can be salvaged through the Fremen, if you like. That the other way that we're mainly educated is by the planet and the Fremen, but the 8 Kings is our real educator in the books, and of course she's wrong. That's the great thing. It's that, as you said, the scientist I've got always right, thinking logically, blah blah blah. That moment of realization is his eureka moment. And bugger, I've got it all wrong. Boom. And I always found it very funny. I thought it was a really comic death in that kind of tragic comic kind of way. If you know, probably not. I don't know if you know Aeschylus, the father of tragedy, died by getting a torch dropped on his head. I think that's hysterical, yet quite tragic at the same time. That's the kind of thing I'm trying to talk about, I suppose. But I don't know. I still think it's a bit of a. I'm hoping it doesn't have. For me personally, I don't.